Good evening. Welcome to Tori's Stories. Tonight we are going to be reading Serafina and the Black Cloak. All right. Baltimore State, Asheville, North Carolina, 1899. Serafina opened her eyes and scanned the darkened workshop, looking for any rats stupid enough to come out into her territory while she sleeps. She knew they were out there, just beyond the nightly rage, crawling in the cracks and shadows of the great house's sprawling basement, kneel to steal whatever they could from the kitchens and storerooms. She had spent most of the day, napping in her favorite out-of-the-way places. But it was here, curled up on an old mattress behind the rusty boiler, in the protection of the workshop, that she felt most at home. Hammers, wrenches, and gears hung down from the rough-hewn beams, and the familiar smell of machinery oil filled the air. Her first thought, as she looked around her and listened into the reaching darkness, was that it felt like a good night for hunting. Her pa, who had worked on construction of Baltimore estates before she had lived in the basement without permission ever since, lay sleeping on a cot he'd secretly built behind the supply racks. Embers glowed in the old metal barrel over which he had cooked their dinner of chicken and grits a few hours before. They huddled around the cook fire for warmth as they ate. As usual, she had eaten chicken, but left the grits. "Eat your supper," her pa had grumbled. "Did," she had answered, setting down a half-empty tin plate. "Your whole supper," he said, pushing the plate towards her, "or you're never going to get any bigger than a shat." Her pa likened her to a skinny baby pig when he wanted to get a rise out of her, figuring she'd get so furious with him that she'd wolf those nasty grits down her throat despite herself. "I'm not going to eat grits, Pa," she said, smiling a little, "no matter how many times you put 'em in front of me." "They ain't nothing but ground up corn, girl," he said, poking at the fire with a stick to arrange the other sticks the way he wanted them. "Everybody and his uncle likes corn, 'cept you. You know I can't stomach anything green or yellow or disgusting like that, Pa, so quit hollering at me." "If I was hollering, you know it," he said, shoving his poker stick into the fire. By and by, they soon forgot the grits and went on to talk about something else. It made Serafina smile to think about her dinner with her father. She couldn't imagine much else in the world, except maybe sleeping in the warmth of one of the basement's small sunlit windows that went finer than a bit battner with her paw. Careful not to wake him, she slinked off her mattress, padded across the workshop's gritty stone floor, and snuck onto the winding passageway. While still rubbing the sleep out of her eyes and stretching out her arms and legs, she couldn't help but feel a trace of excitement. The tantalizing sensations of starting a brand new night tingled through her body. She felt her muscles and her senses coming alive, as if she were an owl stirring its wings and flexing its talons before it flies off for a ghostly hunt. She moved quietly through the darkness, past the laundry rooms, pantries, and kitchen. The basement had been bustling with servants all day, but the rooms were empty now and dark, just the way she liked them. She knew that the Vanderbilts and their many guests were sleeping on the second and third floors above her, but here it was quiet. She loved to prowl through the endless corridors and shadowed storage rooms. She knew the touch and feel, the glint and gloom, in every nook and cranny. This was her domain at night, and hers alone. She heard a faint slithering just ahead, The night was beginning quickly. She stopped. She listened. 2 doors down. The scrambling of tiny feet on a bare floor. She crept forward along the wall. When the sound stopped, she stopped as well. When the sound resumed, she crept forward once more. It was a technique she taught herself by the age of 7. Move when they're moving. Stay still when they're still. Now she could hear the creatures breathing, the scratching of their toenails on the stone, the dragging of their tails. She felt the familiar trembling in her fingers and the tightness in her legs. She slipped through the half-open door to the storeroom and saw them in the darkness. 2 huge rats, covered in greasy brown fur, had slithered one by one upon the drain pipe in the floor. The intruders were obviously newcomers, foolishly scoundering for cockroaches when they had been slurping custard off fresh-baked pastries just down the hall. Without making a sound or even disturbing the air, she stalked slowly towards the rats. Her eyes focused on them. Her ears picked up every sound they made. She could even smell their foul sewer stench. All the while, they went about their rotten, ratty business and had no idea she was there. She stopped just a few feet behind them, hidden in the blackness of a shadow, poised for the leap. This was the moment she loved, the moment just before she lunged. Her body swayed slightly back and forth, turning her angle of attack. Then the pounce. The one quick, explosive movement, she grabs the squealing, writhing rats with her bare hands. "Gotcha, you nasty vermins," she hisses. The smaller rat squirmed in terror, desperate to get away, but the larger one twisted around and bit her hand. "There'll be none of that," she snarled, clamping the rat's neck firmly between her fingers and thumb. The rats wriggled wildly, but she kept a good, hard hold on them and wouldn't let them go. It had taken her a while to learn the lesson when she was younger that once you had them, you had to squeeze hard and hold on no matter what, even if their little claws scratched you and their scaly tails curled around your hand like a sort of nasty gray snake. Finally, after several seconds of vicious struggling, the exhausted rats realized they couldn't escape her. They went still and stared suspiciously at her with their black, beady eyes. Their sniveling little noses and wickedly long whiskers vibrated with fear. The rat who bit her slowly slithered his long, scaly tail around her wrist, wrapping it to 2 times, stretching for new advantage to pry himself free. "Don't even try it," she warned him. Still bleeding from his bite, she was in no mood for ratty schemes. She had been bitten before, but she never did like it much. Carrying the grisly beast in her clenched fist, she took them down the passageway. It felt good to get 2 rats before midnight, and they were particularly ugly characters, the kind that would chew straight through a burlap sack to get to the grain inside, or knock eggs off the shelf so they could lick the mess off the floor. She climbed the old stone stairs that led outside, then walked across the moonlit grounds of the estate all the way to the edge of the forest. There, she hurled the rats into leaves. "Now get on out of here and don't come back," she shouted at them. "I won't be so nice next time." The rats tumbled across the forest floor with the force of her fierce throw and then came to a trembling stop, expecting a killing blow. When it didn't come, they turned and looked up at her astonishment. "Get going before I change my mind," she said. Hesitating no longer, the rats scurried into the underbush. There had been a time when the rats she caught weren't so lucky, when she'd leave their bodies next to her pa's bed to show him her night's work. but she hadn't done that in a coon's age. Ever since she was a youngin', she studied the men and the women who worked in the basement, so she knew that each one had a particular job. It was her father's responsibility to fix the elevators, dumbwaiters, window gears, steam heating systems, and all of the other mechanical contraceptions on which the 250-room mansion depended. He even made sure a pipe organ in the grand banquet hall worked properly for Mr. and Mrs. Vanderbilt's fancy balls. Besides her pa, there were cooks, kitchens, maids, coal shovelers, chimney sweeps, laundry women, pastry makers, housemaids, footmen, and countless others. When she was 10 years old, she had asked, "Do I have a job like everyone else, Pa?" "Of course you do," he said. But she suspected that it wasn't true. He didn't want to hurt her feelings. "What is it? What's my job?" she pressed him. "It's actually an extremely important position around here. And there ain't no one who does it better than you, Sarah." "Tell me, Paul, what is it?" "I reckon you're Baltimore State CRC. What's that mean?" she asked in excitement. "You're the chef rat catcher," he said. However the words were intended, they embezzled themselves in my mind. They embezzled themselves in her mind. She remembered even now, 2 years later, how her little chest had swelled and how she had smiled with pride when he said those words, chef rat catcher. She had liked the sound of that. Everyone knew that rodents were a big problem in a place like Baltimore, with all the sheds and shelves and barns and whatnot. And it was true that she had shown a natural-born talent for snatching and canning, food-stealing, drop-leaving, disease-infected, four-legged vermins that so eluded from the adult folk with their crude traps and poison. Mice, which were timid and prone to panic-induced mistakes at key moments, were no trouble at all for her to catch. It was the rats that gave her a scamper each night. It was the rats that she had honed her skills. She was 12 years old now, and that was she. And she was I'm so sorry. She was 12 years old now, and that was who she was, Serafina CRC. But she watched the two rats run into the forest. A strange, powerful feeling took hold of her. She wanted to follow them, wanted to see what they saw beneath the leaf and twig, to explore the rocks and dells, the streams, the wonders. But her paw had forbidden her. Never go into the forest, he had told her many times. There are dark forces there that no one understands. Things that ain't natural and can do you wicked harm. She stood at the edge of the forest and looked as far as she could into the trees. For years, she heard stories of people who got lost in the forest and never returned. She wondered what dangers lurked there. Was it black magic, demons, some sort of heinous beast? What was her paw so afraid of? She might bandy back and forth with her paw about all sorts of things just for the jump of it, like refusing her grits, sleeping all day and hunting all night, and spying on the Vanderbilts and their guest. But she never argued about this. She knew when she said those words, they were serious to her dead mama. For all the spiny talk and all the sneak about, sometimes you just stayed quiet and did what you were told because you sensed it was a good way to keep breathing. Feeling strangely lonesome, she turned away from the forest and gazed back to the estate. The moon rose above the steeply pitched slate roofs of the house and reflected in the panes of the glass and domed the winter garden. The stars sparkled above the mountains. The grass and the trees and the flowers, beautifully manicured grounds, glowed in the midnight light. She could see every detail, every toad, every snail, every other creature of the night. A lone mockingbird sang an evening song from a magnolia tree, and the baby hummingbirds, tucked into their tiny nest among climbing wisteria, rustled into their sleep. It lifted her chin a bit to think that her pa had helped build all of this. He had been one of hundreds of the stonemasons, wood carvers, and other craftsmen who come to Asheville from surrounding mountains to construct Baltimore State years before. He had stayed on to maintain machinery. But when all the other basement workers went home to their families each night, he and Serafina hid among the steaming pipes and metal tools in the workshop like stowaways in the engine room of a great ship. The truth was, they had no place else to go, no kin to go home to. Whenever they asked about her mama, her father refused to talk about her. So there wasn't anyone else besides her pa, and they made the basement their home for as long as she could remember. How come we don't live in the servants' quarters or in the town like the other workers, Pa? She had asked many times. Yeah, never mind. Never you mind about that, he would grumble in reply. Over the years, her pa had taught her how to read and write pretty well and told her plenty of stories about the world, but he was never too keen on talking about what she wanted to talk about, which was going into the deep down in his heart on what happened to her mama and why she didn't have brothers and sisters, or why she and her pa didn't have any friends who come around to call. Sometimes she wanted to reach inside of him and shake him up to see what would happen. But most of the time, her pa just slept all night and worked all day and cooked their dinner in the evening and told her stories, and they had a pretty good life, the two of them. And she didn't shake him because she knew she didn't want him to be shook, so she just let him be. At night, when everyone else in the house was asleep, she crept upstairs, snatched books to read in the moonlight. She overheard the butler boast to visiting writer that Mr. Vanderbilt had collected 22,000 books, only half of which fit in the library room. The others were stored in tables and shelves throughout the house, and Serafina were like juniperberries ripe for picking, too tempting to resist. No one seemed to notice when a book went missing and was back in its place a few days later. She had read about all the great battles between the states and the tattered flags flying that she had read in the steaming iron beast and the hurtled people hither and yon. She wanted to sneak into the graveyard at night and Tom and Huck and be shipwrecked with the Swiss Family Robinson. Some nights she longed to be one of the four sisters and their loving mother and Little Women. Other nights she imagined meeting the ghost of Sleepy Hollow or tapping with Poe's Black Raven. She liked to tell her pa about the books she read, and she often made up stories of her own filled with imaginary friends and strange families and the ghost in the night. But he was never interested in the tales of fancy and fright. He was far too sensible of a man for all of that and didn't like to believe in anything but bricks and bolts and solid things. More and more, she wondered what it would be like to have some sort of secret friend who her pa didn't know about. Someone she could talk about things. Someone she could talk to about things. But she didn't tend to meet too many children her age sulking through the basement in the dead of night. A few of the low-level kitchen scullins and boiler tenders who worked in the basement went home each night and had seen her darting here and there and knew vaguely who she was. But the maids and manservants who worked on the main floors did not, and certainly the master and mistress of the house didn't know she existed. The Vanderbilts are very kind folk, Sarah, her pa had told her, but they ain't our kind folk. You keep yourself scarce when they come about. Don't let anyone get a good look at you, and whenever you do, don't tell anyone your name or who you are. Do you hear? Serafina did hear. She heard very well. She could hear a mouse change its mind. Yet she didn't know exactly why her pa lived the way he did. She didn't know why her father had hid away from the world, why he was ashamed of her. But she knew one thing for sure, that she loved him with all her heart, and the last thing she ever wanted to do was cause him trouble. So she had become an expert on moving undetected, not just to catch rats, but to avoid people too. When she was feeling particularly brave or lonely, she darted upstairs into the comings and goings of the sparkling folk. She snuck and crept and hid. She was small for her age and light of foot. The shadows were her friends. She spied on fancy-dressed guests, and they arrived in their splendid horse-drawn carriages. No one upstairs even saw her hiding beneath the bed or behind the door. No one noticed her in the black of the closet when they put their coats inside. When the ladies and gentlemen went on their walks on the grounds, she slipped up right next to them without them knowing and listened to everything they were saying. She loved seeing the young girls in their blue and yellow dresses with ribbons fluttering in their hair, and she ran along with them, and they frolicked through the garden. When the children played hide and seek, they never realized there was another player. Sometimes she'd never even see Mr. and Mrs. Vanderbilt walking arm in arm, and she'd see a 12-year-old nephew riding a horse across the grounds with a sleek black running dog alongside. She had watched them all, but none of them have ever saw her, not even the dog. Lately, she'd been wondering just what would happen if they did. What if the boy glimpsed her? What would she do? What if the dog chased her? Could she get up a tree in time? Sometimes she liked to imagine what she would say if she met Mrs. Vanderbilt face to face. "Hello, Miss V. I catch your rats for you. Would you like them killed or just chucked out?" Sometimes she dreamed of wearing fancy dresses and ribbons in her hair and shiny shoes on her feet. But sometimes, just sometimes, she longed not just to listen secretly to the people around her, but talk to them. Not just to see them, but to be seen. As she walked through the moonlight across the open grass and back to the main house, she wondered what would happen if one of the guests, or perhaps the young master of the bedroom on the second floor, happened to wake and look out the window and see a mysterious girl walking alone in the night. Her pa never spoke of it, but she knew she wasn't exactly normal looking. She had a skinny little body, nothing but muscle and bone and sinew. Nothing but muscle and bone and sinew. Yeah. She didn't own a dress, or she wore one of her pa's old work shirts, which she cinched around her narrow waist and within the length of her fibrous twine that she scavenged from a workshop. He didn't buy her any clothes because she didn't want people in town to ask questions and start meddling. Meddling was something he could never brook. Her long hair wasn't a single color like normal people, but varying shades of golden light brown. Her face had a particularly angularity in the cheeks. And she had large, steady amber eyes. She could see the night as well, and she could see during the day. Even her soundless hunting skills weren't exactly normal. Every person she encountered, especially her pa, made too much noise when they walked, and they were pure of big Belgian draft horses that pulled the farm equipment in Mr. Vanderbilt's fields. And it all made her wonder, looking up at the window of the great house, what did the people sleeping in the rooms dream of, and which one colored hair, and their long pointy noses, and their big bodies lying on their soft beds all through the glorious darkness of night. What did they long for? What made them laugh or jump? What did they feel inside? When they had dinner at night, did the children eat grits or just chicken? She glided down the stairs, back into the basement. She heard something in the distant corridors. She stopped and listened, but she couldn't quite make it out. It wasn't a rat, that was certain. Something much larger. But what was it? Curious, she moved towards the sound. She went past her pa's workshop, the kitchen, and the other rooms she knew well, and into the deeper areas where she hunted less often. She heard door closing and then fall of footsteps and muffled noises. Her heart began to thump lightly in her chest. Someone was walking around through the corridors of the basement. Her basement. She moved closer. It wasn't the servant who collected the garbage each night, or one of the footmen fetching the late-night snack for guests. She knew the sound of their footsteps as well. Sometimes the butler's assistant, who was 11, would stop in the corridor and gobble down a few cookies from the silver tray that the butler had sent him to retrieve. She'd stand just around the corner from him in the darkness and pretend that they were friends, just talking and enjoying each other's company for a while. Then the boy would wipe down the powdered sugar off his lips, and off he'd go, hurrying up the stairs to catch up the time he had lost. But this wasn't him. Whoever it was, he wore what sounded like hard-soled shoes, expensive shoes. But a gentleman proper had no business coming down into this area of the house. Why was he wandering through the dark passages of the middle of the night? Increasingly curious, she followed the stranger carefully to avoid being seen. Whenever he snuck up close enough to almost see him, she could make out what was the shadow of a tall black shape carrying a dimly lit lantern. And there was another shadow there too, someone or something with him. But she didn't dare creep close enough to see who or what it was. It was a vast basement with many different rooms, corridors, and levels which had been built into the slope of the earth beneath the house. Some areas, like the kitchen and the laundry room, had smooth plaster on the walls and windows. The rooms were plainly finished, but clean and dry and well suited to daily work of servants. The more distant reaches of the understructure led deep into the damp and earthened burrows of the house's massive foundation. Here's the dark, hardened motor oozed out of the out from in between the roughly hewed stone blocks and formed the walls of the ceiling, and the seldom went there because it was cold, dirty, and dank. Suddenly her footsteps changed directions. They came towards her. 5 screeching rats came running across the corridor ahead of the footfalls, more terrified than rodents she had ever seen. Spiders crawled out of the cracks in the walls. Cockroaches and centipede erupted from the earthen floors. Astounded by what she was seeing, she caught her breath and pressed herself to the wall, frozen in fear like a rabbit, Kit trembling beneath the shadow of the passing hawk. As the man walked towards her, she heard another sound too. It was a shuffling agonization like a small person, slippered feet perhaps, a child. But there was something wrong. The child's feet were scraping on the stone, sometimes sliding. The child was crippled. No. The child was being dragged. "No, sir. Please, no," the girl whimpered, her voice trembling with despair. "We're not supposed to be down here," the girl spoke like someone who had been raised in a well-heeled family to attend a fancy school. "Don't worry. We're going right in here," the man said, stopping the door just around the corner from Serafina. Now she could hear his breathing, the movement of his hands, and the rustling of his clothing. Flashes of heat scorched through her. She wanted to run and flee, but she couldn't get her legs to move. "There's nothing to be frightened of, child," he said as the girl. "I'm not going to hurt you." The way these words caused her hair in the back of Serafina's neck to rise. Don't go with him, she thought. Don't go. The girl sounded like she was just younger than her, and Serafina wanted to help her, but she couldn't find the courage. She pressed herself against the wall, certain that she would be heard or seen. Her legs trembled, feeling as if they would crumble beneath her. She couldn't see what happened next, but suddenly the girl let out a blood-curdling scream. The piercing sound caused Serafina to jump and had stifled her own scream. Then she heard a struggle as the girl tore away from the man and fled down the corridor. Run, girl, run, Serafina thought. Her man's steps faded into the distance as he went after her. Serafina could tell that he wasn't running full out, but moving steadily, relentlessly, like he knew the girl couldn't escape him. Serafina's paws had told her about how red wolves chased down and killed deer in the mountains with dogs' stamina rather than bursts of speed. Serafina didn't know what to do. Should she hide in the dark corner and hope he didn't find her? Should she flee with the terror-stricken rats and spiders while she had the chance? She wanted to run back to her father, but what about the child? The girl was so helpless, so slow, weak, and frightened, and more than anything, she needed a friend to help her fight. Serafina wanted to be that friend. She wanted to help her, but she couldn't bring herself to move in that direction. Then she heard the girl scream again. That dirty, rotten rat's gonna kill her, Serafina thought. He's gonna kill her. With a burst of anger and courage, she raced towards the sound. Her legs felt the explosion of speed. Her mind blazed with fear and exhilaration. She turned a corner after corner, but when it came to the most mossy stone stairway that led into the deepest bowels of the sub-basement, she stopped, gasping for breath, and shook her head. It was a cold, wet, slimy, horrible place that she had always done her best to avoid, especially in the winter. She'd heard stories that they stored dead bodies in the sub-basement in the winter when the ground was too frozen to dig a grave. Why in the world would that girl have gone down there? Serafina made her halting down the wet, sticky stairs, lifting and shaking off her foot after each slimy step she took. When the last she reached the bottom, she followed a long slanting corridor where the ceilings dripped with brown sludge. The whole dank, disgusting place gave her the jitters, something fierce, but she kept going. You've got to help her, she told herself again. You can't turn back. She wound her way through the labyrinth of twisting tunnels. She turned right, then left, then right, until she lost track of how far she had gone. Then she heard the sound of a frightening and shouting just around the corner ahead of her. She was very close. She hesitated, frightened, her heart pounding so hard it felt like it was going to burst. Her body shook all over. She didn't want to go another step, but friends had to help friends. She didn't know much about life, but she did know that for sure she wasn't going to run away like a scared out of her wits squirrel just when somebody needed her most. Trembling all over, she steadied herself at the best she could, sucked in the deep breath, and pushed herself around the corner. A broken lantern lay tipped on the stone floor, its glass shattered and the flames still burning. In its halo of flittering light, a girl in a yellow dress struggled for her life. A tall man in a black cloak hood, his hands stained with blood, grabbing the girl by her wrist. The girl tried to pull away. No, let me go, she screamed. Quiet down, the man told her. His voice was soothing in dark, unwordly tone. I'm not going to hurt you, child, he said for the second time. The girl had curly blonde hair and pale white skin. She had fought to escape, but the man in the black coat pulled her towards him. He tangled her in his arms. She flailed and struck him in the face with her tiny fist. Just stay still and it will all be over, he said, putting her towards him. Serafina suddenly realized that she made a dreadful mistake. This was far more than she could handle. She knew that she should help the girl, but she was scared that her feet were stuck to the floor. She was so scared that her feet were stuck to the floor. She couldn't even breathe, let alone fight. Help her, Serafina's mind screamed at her. Help her! Attack the rat! Attack the rat! She finally plucked up the courage and charged forwards, and just at that moment the man in the satin cloak floated upwards, as if possessed by a smoky spirit. The girl screamed. The folds of the cloak slithered down her like the tentacles of a hungry serpent. The cloak seemed to move of its own accord, wrapping, twisting, accompanied by disturbing rattled noises like hissing threats or of 100 rattlesnakes. Serafina saw the girl's horrified face looking at her from within the folds of the enveloping cloak, the girl's pleading blue eyes wide with fear. "Help me! Help me!" Then the folds closed over her. The scream went silent. The girl disappeared, leaving nothing but blackness of the cloak. Serafina gasped in shock. The moment the girl was struggling to get free, the next vanished into thin air. The cloak had consumed her. Overwhelmed with confusion, grief, and fear, Serafina just stood there in a stunned bewilderment. For several seconds, the man seemed to vibrate violently, and ghoulish aura glowed around him in the dark, shimmering haze. A horribly foul smell of rotten guts invaded Serafina's nostrils, forcing her to jerk her head back. She wrinkled her nose and squinched her mouth and tried not to breathe in. She must have made some sort of involuntary gagging noises, for the man in the black coat suddenly turned and looked at her, seeing her for the first time. It felt like a giant claw gripped around his chest. The folds of the man's hood shrouded his face, and she could see his eyes blazed with an unnatural light. She stood frozen, utterly terrified. The man whispered in a raspy voice, "I'm not going to hurt you, child.